This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about the all-new Leica Noctilux-M 50mm f1.2. This is essentially a modern reissue or historical version of the very first Noctilux. Now, there are multiple versions of Noctiluxes, you might be saying. Well, let's clear that up. There's actually 4 different versions of the 50mm Noctilux. There's also a 75mm, but in terms of the 50s, first one came out in 1966. It was a 50mm f1.2. This was followed with the f1.0, which was a Walter Mandler design. There were several variants on that dealing with the lens hood and how it kind of was physically constructed, but the elements were all the same. Then we have the modern Peter Carbe era Noctilux, which is a f0.95. And then we have this one, which is a reissue of the very first one. All right, so why in 1966 do we need an f1.2 lens or a fast aperture lens? Well, you have to remember, film speeds in 1966 were a little bit different than our high ISOs of today. Color film, namely Kodachrome, was an ISO of 32. Not 3200, 32. Black and white film was typically around 100. Now, photographers were pushing film back in those days, particularly people who were photojournalists, who were needing to shoot in natural light and really low light situations. But what happens is when you push film, you increase contrast. You're already shooting in a very high contrast situation, so the need arose to have a lens with a really fast aperture. Now, this is very different than what we deal with today, where we have digital cameras with incredible high ISO settings. In fact, ISO is just a metaphor for what we had in the film days. It's really digital gain on the sensor. I can shoot on the M10P comfortably at 12,500 ISO, and it's very usable. And the SL2S probably goes a little higher than that even. So why do we need a fast lens in the modern day? Well, the term bokeh came to use fairly recently, I would say in the 90s, and it became kind of an aesthetic of the out of focus areas. So what used to be a necessity has now turned into an aesthetical choice because you have very selective focus with a very narrow field of focus. And so you're able to get really blown out images with beautiful bokeh in the background. That's essentially why we use fast lenses today. The first Noctilux was designed for Leica by Helmut Marx and Peter Sendel. There's a few changes on the reissue lens from the original, so you're going to notice that the elements are slightly refined in a few places, and we are using modern coatings at this point. One thing that is very notable about the original Noctilux is that was the very first lens to incorporate aspherical elements into its lens design. There are actually 2 aspherical elements in that lens. Now, today, it's very common for lenses to have aspherical elements incorporated into their design, but manufacturing is completely different today than it was in 1966. This was very difficult to do. Aspherical elements had to be ground, and they had to be ground by hand. Now, Leica had a machine to make these lenses with. They had 2 employees that could actually use said machines, so you can imagine that they didn't produce a lot of that very first lens. In fact, by today's count, there's only 1,757 of those in existence. This was a really significant lens, though, because it enabled photographers to shoot in very low light situations. It worked as a lens, and it was copied a couple of years later. Nikon and Canon came out with their 55mm f1.2 lenses, and later 50mm lenses. Nikon had a 58mm f1.2. The f1.2 was kind of a hit. In fact, here's an image of Henri Cartier-Bresson himself with the original Noctilux. He's photographing the Paris riots in 1968. Note that it is always best to show up to photograph a riot wearing a suit. If you look at those images that he took, they don't necessarily have any of the blatant characteristics of the Noctilux. Of course, they're also being taken in broad daylight. He's probably stopping the lens down considerably. But there is one image that I found that was at auction at Christie's a while back that clearly has the Noctilux f1.2 look, the very shallow depth of field. It's a photo of a couple. She's photographing the Paris riots. Also, this is an excellent example of the visual signature that this lens has. So what exactly is the visual signature that you can expect from the Noctilux f1.2 reissue? Well, many of you know that I live in the beautiful city of Fort Worth, Texas. These are some images that I made at this little bar called Thompson's Bookstore, and you can see that the images are really quite beautiful. This was a low light situation. Now, Noctilux lenses are never designed to be completely clinically sharp to the corners, edge to edge, with all distortions corrected. There are many imperfections in this lens, but that's kind of the beauty of it and what you learn to embrace. There is vignetting on the lens. I think it's got a nice character to it. One of the other things I want to note about this lens is that if you compare this to modern lenses, particularly the f/0.95 version of this lens, it's not going to be nearly as sharp with the points that are in focus. In fact, wide open, it is pretty soft, particularly if you're closer to the minimum focus distance. The bokeh is gorgeous on this lens, and let's be honest, that's what you're going to get it for. Another note that I want to make is this image in particular was shot at f5.6, and you can see that it still retains a lot of that kind of historical lens vibe to it. It's not going to be as clinically sharp as a modern lens, but that's the whole point of this lens. This is a 1966 lens design, and it's going to give you, I don't want to use the word softer look, but a lot less clinical. So if you want an older cinematic look, a lot of filmmakers prefer older lenses just for the specific reason, this is the lens for you. The Noctilux f1.2 is designed with 6 elements in 4 groups, so we have a classic double gauze configuration. The outer elements are both aspherical, although they are machined now, they are no longer hand ground. And another cool thing about this lens is there are 16 aperture blades. This is by far more than you're going to find on any other lens produced today, and so this is going to ensure that that bokeh look that you want remains consistent when you stop down, so spherical highlights actually stay round. I want to dive a little deeper into the performance of this lens, and I want to talk about the cost, but first I want to give a shout out to our sponsor this week, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace.com. I am actually redesigning my personal website right now, and I'm going to be using Squarespace. So I've been sharing a lot of images with you guys in these videos. This is something that I want to share more of, be able to put links and things to when I have collections made. Squarespace is an awesome place to do that. It really is the easiest way to build a website. You can build an online portfolio. You can even build an e-commerce store on here. The tools have really gotten good. How easy is Squarespace to use? Well, you're going to start with one of their award-winning templates. Now, all of these templates are customizable. Your content is separate from the template, so you can change the entire look. If you feel like you need a complete refresh or you're not sure on something, you can get things to look exactly like you want them. What good is a website if nobody's looking at it? Well, Squarespace have the right social tools and email integrations in here so you can do your own website promotion as well. My favorite part of Squarespace, well, it's really intuitive. So if you can drag and drop a folder of images, you can build a photo gallery. It's that easy. You can easily go into the settings to customize everything to your liking, hook it up to your own domain. In fact, they sell those too, and you are in business. So head over to Squarespace using the link below this video, and you can try it out for absolutely free. And when you do decide that Squarespace is right for you, I can save you an additional 10% on your first order by using offer code AOP. So once again, offer code AOP. And I want to give a special shout out and thanks to the awesome folks at Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Let's dig a little deeper into characteristics. The first thing I want to talk about is sharpness. So I'm going to be honest, if you want a really sharp modern Leica lens, this is probably not your lens. This is a vintage lens design, and photographers that want that kind of look are going to be thrilled with this. As I mentioned earlier, even at f5.6, it's very natural. It has a more cinematic look. I personally really like this. It does have a lot more of a 1960s feel to it. I've not had an opportunity to compare this to the original version, but I will say in the reissue that color rendition is impressively good. This is not the case with a lot of retro-styled lenses that you can buy today, but Leica used modern coatings on this lens, so you're going to get the best of both worlds with this. Now, performance, I'm going to be honest here, performance is a challenge with this lens. As I mentioned, the images are a little soft when you're shooting wide open, especially at the minimum focus distance. You want things to move a little further back. One little non-scientific test that I like to do with all the lenses that I review is to look at the field of focus. So what we need to do is shoot something with texture. I use the street in this case. When I take it into Photoshop and run it through the Find Edges filter, you're going to only see what is sharp in the image, and you can see that wide open at a close focus distance, this is really not sharp corner to corner, and so it becomes kind of a challenge to use. A lot of times you think you've nailed the focus, it looks slightly off in the image, and it's actually on, it's just a little bit soft wide open. Now, of course, this improves as you stop down, and it's a 1.2 lens, so you can start stopping down to improve that performance, but at a minimum focus distance, it really doesn't start improving till about f2.8. So it's something you're going to have to learn how to live with. It is a look, and you kind of have to work towards the characteristics of this lens to get the most out of it. That could be a deal breaker for some people. I also want to note that the minimum focus distance on this lens is 1 meter, or about 3 feet 4 inches, which is common of lenses of this era. It's also the same across the board with all Noctilux lenses. That is the same minimum focus distance. So M-mount lenses are a fascinating challenge because they're designed to be used with a rangefinder camera. If the lens is too too big, it blocks the rangefinder, and when you use the lens hood on this lens, there is definitely some blockage, even though it's ventilated so you can see through parts of it. M-mount lens design is an art unto itself. It always comes down to trade-offs, but honestly, this lens has a very organic quality to it, and you learn how to get the best out of it, and the results are absolutely fantastic. So inevitably, I need to address the pain point of this lens, which is the price tag. So the Noctilux f1.2 reissue lens comes in at a little under $8,000 US. So I don't know, you could look at this as expensive, or you could look at it as a real deal, because the f0.95 version of this lens, well, Leica raised their prices last year, and that one comes in at over $12,000 now. And then you could compare this to the original, which is a more fair comparison because the look is very similar. It's the classic look. If you want to find an original Noctilux f1.2, well, I mentioned earlier there's only 1,700 or so of these in existence, and so therefore they are scarce. Therefore, they are collector's items. Therefore, they go for astronomical sums of money. I've seen them sell for as high as $50. You go on eBay and you see people asking over $100,000 for them sometimes. So when you put it in context, I mean, if you want this look, then that price tag doesn't look so bad in the end. But what about alternatives? So I have reviewed a lot of older vintage type lenses on this show. One I touched on recently was a lens that I had an insect in that had been sitting in a drawer for years and years. Anyway, that was a Canon 55mm f1.2. It is not as old as this design. This was 1966, and I believe the Canon came out in the 70s. Nikon had some in the 70s that were 55mm, and you can get those later versions that were 50mm f1.2. But I actually argue they're all slightly unique in the look, and it depends on what you want, what you're happy with, what kind of features you want in a lens. Those were SLR lenses. They had improvements made on them with closer focus distances, so on and so forth. But if you want the Leica look that this lens gives you, this really is the only one. And so the alternative I would actually recommend is, if you don't need to own it, you could rent it like I did. That's considerably less money than fishing up $8,000 to buy one new. Should also mention Voigtlander in here, because I think Voigtlander is a company that makes classic type lenses. They have the f1.2 50mm Nocton. I have it in Sony mount. It's a really cool lens, and it has sort of that historical look. It's not quite the same look as the Leica, but that's a lens that you can get for at a very affordable price that comes new with a warranty. So they're all alternatives like that as well. When we're talking about alternatives, essentially they're just that. They're alternatives. And yes, it's very true that for a lot less money, you can get a historical look from a wide variety of lenses, both used and new. However, this lens is extraordinarily unique, not only in terms of the look that it renders, but it's a historically pretty important lens. In fact, I think it's one of the more significant lenses in the history of 35mm photography anyway. It was the first f1.2 50mm lens. It was the first lens to incorporate aspherical elements, and I think it's really cool that Leica have given us a reissue option of a lens that's astronomically unaffordable. Anyway, I would love to know what you guys think. I'm sure you'll tell me either way, so drop me a comment below. Catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.